Millionaire left his disabled black wife for another woman. Her next move brought him to his knees. They called me the pitiful wife in the chair. The woman who should smile politely, keep quiet, and thank her stars she was lucky to marry a man like Martin Holloway. To his wealthy friends I was a decoration at best, a burden at worst. They whispered at galas, at golf clubs, and behind crystal glasses of champagne that I was only there because Martin had taken pity on a black girl from nowhere. I pretended not to hear, but their words sliced deeper than any blade. The truth? I had a law degree. I had a thriving career before the accident. I had a life. But in their eyes my worth vanished the moment my legs failed me. Before it all fell apart, people envied my life. I lived in a mansion on the edge of the city, with marble floors that gleamed like ice and chandeliers that glittered as if the stars themselves had been trapped inside. Martin Holloway, my husband, was a millionaire entrepreneur who owned Holloway Enterprises, a chain of logistics and tech companies. His name appeared in glossy magazines and business journals, hailed as a self-made man, the golden boy of modern wealth. And by his side me, Danica Williams. At charity dinners I wore gowns that fit like second skin. We flew to London for shopping trips, to Sydney for holidays, to New York for art auctions. People smiled at me, but even then, I felt the glances linger too long on my skin, on my curls, on the contrast between me and the powerful white man I had married. They thought I didn't notice, but I did. At luncheons, women would ask in falsely sweet tones, "So Danica, how did you and Martin meet?" As if it were impossible that a man like him could fall in love with a woman like me without some hidden reason. But I ignored it because I believed in the vows we made on that warm June evening when he promised to love me for better or worse. I clung to those words, never imagining how quickly worse would arrive. It was a storm that changed everything. A storm that stole not only my body's strength but my place in his world. One rainy night, headlights flashed, tires screamed, and metal crushed around me like paper. I woke in a sterile hospital room 3 days later, pain clawing through my body, only to hear the verdict: paralyzed from the waist down. Martin sat beside me, his hand wrapped around mine, eyes brimming with tears. He whispered, "Nothing will change, Danica. We'll get through this together." I believed him. Oh, how foolishly I believed him. At first, he played the part of the devoted husband. He hired the best physical therapists, including Melanie Hart, a woman whose calm voice and steady hands became my anchor. He oversaw renovations, installing ramps and lifts. He canceled trips and told me I was his priority. For a while I thought love could survive anything. I thought our bond was unbreakable. But the mansion began to feel less like a home and more like a gilded cage. As months turned into years, the mask slipped. Business trips grew longer. Phone calls became shorter. At events, Martin started leaving me behind, saying the venues weren't accessible enough, when really he didn't want to will me in. The whispers from society sharpened. She's not what he needs anymore. Such a shame, he deserves someone vibrant. And the cruelest of all, that chair will always remind him he can do better. Racism and ableism tangled together like poison vines, strangling what dignity I had left. The humiliation was quiet at first. An invitation forgotten. A gala program where my name was omitted. Friends who once called daily stopped picking up. Even Martin's mother looked at me differently, her smiles tight, her eyes glinting with disapproval. I told myself it was stress, expansion, the pressures of business. But in my heart I felt the walls closing in. I could no longer walk into a room and be seen as Danica, the woman, the lawyer, the partner. I was the wife in the chair, the black woman they tolerated for appearances, the ghost haunting her own home. I remember one evening in particular. Martin came home late, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his, laughter still caught in his throat. He kissed the top of my head as though I were a child and went straight to his study, shutting the door. Alone in that cavernous living room, I stared at the grand piano I once played, the gowns hanging limp in the closet upstairs, the walls that echoed with silence. I had given my trust, my love, my life to a man who now saw me as an inconvenience. That night tears blurred my vision, but in that blur something hardened inside me. Because here is what Martin Holloway, and all those people who pitied me, never understood: silence does not mean surrender. Pity is not the same as defeat. And weakness? Weakness is often the mask that hides a rising storm. They called me pitiful. They called me forgotten. But one day soon they would call me something else. The cracks that had begun to show in my marriage soon split wide open, and I could no longer pretend they were anything but what they were. Martin Holloway was not the husband who once swore to love me in sickness and in health. He was a man slowly erasing me from his world, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but my wheelchair and the shadows of who I used to be. The excuses began small. He told me late meetings couldn't be avoided. He said investors demanded his presence out of town. He swore business was consuming him, but I saw the change in his eyes. They no longer softened when they looked at me. They darted, restless, searching for escape. When he did sit by my side, his phone was always in his hand, his face lit by a glow that felt more intimate than any look he spared me. One Thursday morning, the truth arrived not with words from Martin, but with trembling hands of someone I trusted. Melanie Hart, my physical therapist, came into my room with an envelope pressed against her chest. Her face was pale, her voice breaking. "Danica, you need to see this." My heart pounded as I opened it, and inside were photographs that shattered the fragile illusions I had clung to. There was Martin, my husband of nearly a decade, standing outside a restaurant with a woman half my age, his lips pressed against hers in a kiss that mocked everything we had ever promised each other. Another photo showed them leaving a hotel, their smiles careless, their hands intertwined as though the world belonged only to them. Another captured him fastening a diamond bracelet around her wrist, the same one I had once admired in a store window, believing he was buying it for me. Her name was Samantha Reed, 26, a marketing assistant who had risen far too quickly in Holloway Enterprises, now suddenly promoted to consultant, and conveniently present on every business trip Martin claimed was unavoidable. She was beautiful, blonde, and everything society told him he deserved. And me? I was left at home, the wife who was supposed to accept her place quietly, as if my black skin and my chair were reasons enough to be replaced. The humiliation of it was suffocating. I didn't just lose a husband. I lost my place in the world we had built together. Word spread quickly in circles that thrived on gossip. Invitations that had already grown scarce disappeared completely. At luncheons I once hosted, my name was whispered in tones dripping with pity. She should step aside gracefully. Martin can't be expected to stay bound to her forever. And worse, a man like him needs someone who matches his stature, not a crippled woman reminding him of tragedy. They didn't just mock my disability, they mocked my race too. They saw me as the charity case elevated too high, now cast down to where I belonged. I began to feel invisible, erased from a society I had once helped shape. The deepest cut came from Martin himself. He stopped hiding Samantha. At charity galas she was at his side, her hand resting on his arm where mine once had. At the country club, he introduced her as someone important to his work, smiling as if daring anyone to question him. Even his mother invited her to family gatherings, seating her in the place I used to occupy. I sat alone in the mansion that once rang with laughter, now echoing only with silence, as the man I loved rebuilt his life without me. But pain has a way of transforming into something sharper. Rage. Determination. Sitting in my chair that December morning when Martin came into the bedroom with a folder under his arm, I knew the betrayal had reached its peak. He didn't look at me as his wife. He looked at me as a business inconvenience. Without a trace of tenderness, he dropped the folder in my lap. "I've filed for divorce," he said flatly. "My lawyers have drafted a settlement. It's more than fair, considering the circumstances." I opened it with trembling fingers. The offer was insulting $2 million out of his empire and the right to live in the guest house for a single year. $2 million for 10 years of my life, for my loyalty, for my dignity. Worse still, he had twisted the truth, claiming I had been unfaithful to him with Melanie, my therapist and closest confidant. They called our bond inappropriate. He manufactured lies, signed his name to them, and handed them to me as if they were facts carved in stone. I stared at him, barely able to breathe. "After everything, this is what I'm worth to you?" He didn't even flinch. "Sign it, Danica. Don't make this harder than it has to be. You'll have enough to live comfortably. Don't drag your name through the mud fighting me." Then he left, the sound of his footsteps down the hall a cruel rhythm that echoed in my chest. Alone again, I looked around at the remnants of a life I no longer recognized. Gowns I would never wear again hung untouched. Photos of smiling faces mocked me from silver frames. The ring on my finger felt like a chain, not a promise. Everyone, Martin, his lawyers, his mother, even society, expected me to quietly sign and vanish. They wanted me erased from the story, replaced by Samantha and her flawless smile. They thought I was too weak, too pitiful, too black, too broken to fight back. But what they didn't know was that silence is not surrender. Behind closed doors, in the long lonely hours when they believed I was drowning in despair, I had been learning. I had been planning. And soon, the world would learn that Danica Williams was not done. My story was not ending, it was only beginning. I did not sign the divorce papers. I placed that folder on the nightstand, staring at it as if by sheer will I could set it aflame. That was the night my despair turned into resolve. Martin Holloway thought I would fade quietly, swallowed by pity and whispers. But the fire inside me was only beginning to burn. Every insult, every look of disdain, every racial slur wrapped in polite tones had planted a seed of fury. And fury, when harnessed, becomes power. I realized then that my wheelchair was not a prison. It was a disguise. They saw a broken woman. They never once suspected the strategist I was becoming. In those endless afternoons when Martin thought I was trapped in grief, I had already begun laying the groundwork for something greater. While he paraded Samantha Reed on his arm, I used the isolation he imposed on me as cover. With my law background, I knew how to navigate contracts and financial structures. I knew how to hide money in plain sight, how to build companies behind layers of anonymity. I also knew Martin's empire inside and out, every supplier, every vulnerability, every deal that kept Holloway Enterprises afloat. If I wanted to dismantle the kingdom he had built on my back, I had all the tools I needed. The first step was financial independence. From the joint accounts Martin no longer paid attention to, I siphoned small amounts, never enough to trigger suspicion, but enough to accumulate quietly. That money became the seed of my own empire. Through a shell company called DW Holdings, I purchased my first target, a modest but vital trucking supplier whose contracts accounted for a significant portion of Martin's logistics network. The name on the papers was not mine, but the fingerprints of my strategy were all over it. Melanie Hart became more than a therapist to me. She became my confidant and my ally. Before dedicating herself to physical therapy, Melanie had spent years as a financial crime investigator. She knew how to uncover hidden accounts, how to trace patterns of fraud, how to build a case that could stand in any court. When she saw what Martin had done, how he flaunted Samantha while discarding me, her calm eyes hardened. "Danica," she said one evening, "if he thinks you're powerless, he has no idea who he's dealing with." Together we mapped out a plan step by step. She guided me in making purchases that weakened Holloway Enterprises from the inside. She gathered evidence of his shady dealings. Tax evasions, manipulated contracts, bribes that flowed quietly under the table. Each discovery felt like a piece of armor being fitted onto my body. But my most dangerous weapon was Samantha herself. For months I watched Martin display her proudly, convinced she was his loyal companion. What he didn't know was that Samantha was not as devoted as she appeared. She was ambitious, yes, but also disillusioned. And ambition, when given direction, can be molded into loyalty. When I reached out to her in secret, she listened. She knew Martin's affair with her was built not on love but on power. He treated her as an accessory, just as he had treated me. I offered her something Martin never would: respect and a chance at redemption. "Help me," I whispered to her during a carefully arranged meeting, "and you won't just be his mistress. You'll be the woman who helped bring him down." She agreed. From that moment, every dinner, every business trip, every careless word Martin spoke to Samantha became mine. She slipped copies of documents into her purse, recorded conversations when his arrogance ran unchecked, and relayed every plan he boasted about. He bragged of deals, of government contracts, of money siphoned into accounts hidden overseas. He told her everything, never suspecting she was feeding me every secret. Each revelation was another weapon in my arsenal. Still, the emotional toll was immense. I sat in my wheelchair night after night, replaying in my mind the images of Martin's betrayal. The scent of another woman on his clothes, the hollow tone of his voice when he spoke to me, The disdain in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking, these memories carved deep wounds. But pain became my fuel. Each tear I shed hardened into resolve. I reminded myself that this was no longer just about me. It was about every black woman dismissed as not enough, every disabled person told they were a burden, every spouse discarded when their usefulness ran out. My revenge would not only reclaim my dignity, it would send a message. By the end of that year, I had acquired 3 companies that Martin's empire relied on, all hidden under my holding firm. He didn't even notice the shifts. He was too busy chasing headlines with Samantha on his arm, believing the world still adored him. Melanie kept digging, piecing together a case file that grew thicker by the week. Fraud, insider trading, falsified invoices, government bribes. His empire was rotting beneath its polished surface. And Samantha, with her carefully crafted smiles, continued to feed me information that made each of his moves predictable. The transition from victim to strategist was not sudden. It was built in silence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm out in rage. I sat quietly, a woman in a chair, watching, waiting, planning. And all the while Martin believed he was winning. He thought he had discarded me. He thought he had replaced me. But I knew the day was coming when the tables would turn, when the pitiful wife would walk back into the spotlight not as a victim, but as the architect of his downfall. The day of reckoning did not arrive suddenly, it was crafted, timed, and executed with precision. For months I had watched from the shadows while Martin Holloway strutted through boardrooms and banquets, convinced he was untouchable. He believed his wealth and whiteness shielded him from consequence, that the woman he had left behind could never rise again. But arrogance blinds even the shrewdest men, and his blindness was the opening I needed. The opportunity came in the form of a government contract, the largest deal of his career, worth billions. He boasted to Samantha about how it would cement his legacy, how newspapers would once again call him the empire builder, how he would finally erase the whispers about abandoning his disabled wife. He thought the contract would make him invincible. What he never realized was that the software and supply chains his company depended on were no longer his, they were mine. The morning of the signing, Martin arrived at the government offices in a tailored suit, Samantha by his side in a glittering dress designed to catch cameras. He looked every inch the powerful millionaire. Head held high, smile sharp, hands eager to shake. His lawyers trailed behind him, carrying documents, ready to witness what they believed would be the crown jewel of his empire. Reporters crowded the lobby, snapping photographs, calling his name. Martin thrived under the flash of cameras, the attention feeding his ego. He thought the world still admired him, still envied him, still believed in him. He never once suspected that behind those cameras, I was waiting. When the officials gathered in the conference room and Martin launched into his polished speech, I listened quietly from just outside the doors. His words flowed with the practiced charm that once had enchanted me. Phrases about innovation, responsibility, and commitment to national progress. He smiled with the ease of a man who believed the future belonged to him. But as he closed his presentation, the lead official cleared his throat. Mr. Holloway, before we proceed, we must clarify an ownership matter concerning the software in your proposal. That was my cue. The double doors opened and I rolled into the room, the sound of my chair wheels cutting through the silence. Every head turned. The click of cameras erupted instantly as journalists recognized me. For a heartbeat the entire room seemed frozen. Martin's confident smile faltered, then vanished altogether. His skin drained of color, his hand tightening on Samantha's arm to steady himself. "Danica," he whispered, barely audible, disbelief etched across his face. I held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to let him see the broken woman he remembered. I was no longer the discarded wife. I was the woman holding the future of his empire in my hands. "Mr. Holloway," the official continued, oblivious to the storm breaking in the room, "we'd like you to meet the rightful owner of the software your company is attempting to license. Mrs. Danica Williams, CEO of DW Holdings." Gasps filled the air. Reporters scrambled to capture every word, their pens flying. I lifted my head, my voice steady. "Gentlemen, the software Martin has promised you does not belong to him. It belongs to me. I acquired Digital Solutions 6 months ago. I also own Mitchell Supply and Parker Manufacturing, the very companies he depends on to fulfill this contract. In other words, Martin Holloway has been selling you promises built on assets he no longer controls. The shock on Martin's face was worth every sleepless night I had endured. His lawyers stammered objections, but the officials ignored them. I wasn't finished. I gestured, and Melanie entered the room carrying boxes of files. Her calm expression radiated authority as she set them on the table. These, I explained, are records of Martin's financial misconduct, tax evasion, fraudulent invoices, bribes, insider trading. Evidence gathered carefully and thoroughly. Evidence that will be turned over to federal authorities. Murmurs spread like wildfire, the weight of scandal hanging heavy in the air. Martin finally found his voice, but it cracked under the pressure. You can't do this, Danica. You're my wife. You can't testify against me. His desperation reeked of entitlement, as if he still believed I was bound to him. I smiled coldly. Not anymore. The divorce was finalized this morning. And unlike you, I didn't need to fabricate lies to justify it. The only unfaithful spouse here has always been you. And then Samantha delivered the final blow. She stepped forward, her eyes glistening with triumph rather than shame. Martin, she said softly, everything you've whispered to me for the last year and a half, every deal, every secret, every confession, I passed straight to Danica. Every document you showed me, every call you bragged about, every insult you muttered about her, I recorded it all. The room exploded in chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Lawyers panicked. Officials made urgent calls. And Martin Holloway, the man who believed he could discard me and parade his mistress without consequence, stood trembling, undone by his own arrogance. In that moment I felt no pity, only justice. He had called me pitiful, had treated me as invisible, had let racism and cruelty justify his betrayal. But now the world watched him collapse under the weight of his own sins, while the woman he underestimated commanded the room. The chaos of that conference room marked the end of Martin Holloway's reign. But for me, it was only the beginning of something far greater. As the government officials gathered the files Melanie had provided, and reporters swarmed to capture every flicker of Martin's downfall, I felt a wave of release wash over me. For years I had been painted as the pitiful black wife in a chair, the woman destined to be erased. But now every camera in that room was pointed at me, every headline would carry my name, and every whisper would be of my victory. Martin left that building pale and broken, surrounded by lawyers who knew the empire he built was crumbling. I left with my head high, not just in a wheelchair but in triumph, carried by the truth I had fought so long to reveal. The weeks that followed sealed his fate. To avoid federal prison, Martin agreed to surrender nearly everything. 70% of Holloway Enterprises transferred to me, along with the mansion, private accounts he thought hidden, and the assets he had accumulated on the backs of lies. Watching him sign those papers was a moment I will never forget. His hand shook as he scrawled his signature, the pen cutting across the page like the final nail in his own coffin. He glanced at me, perhaps expecting mercy, but I had none to give. Mercy had no place in the justice he owed me. But it was not the wealth that satisfied me most. It was the reversal of power. Part of the settlement required Martin to remain in the company as a project manager, stripped of authority, reporting to those who once trembled under his commands. Each morning he would walk past the office with my name engraved on the door. Each afternoon he would carry out orders issued by people he once dismissed as unworthy. And each evening he would leave knowing that the woman he had tried to erase now dictated the course of his days. That humiliation was worth more than any mansion or jet. Samantha kept her word too. After delivering the final blow in that conference room, she walked away with a reward, not just money but her freedom. With $1 million payment, she started her own consulting firm, one designed to help women expose the betrayals that once trapped them in silence. I met her for dinner months later, and we laughed at the irony. Martin had flaunted her as the prize that replaced me, but in truth she had been my ally all along, the very key to his ruin. He never saw me for who I really was, she said with a smile, and I realized she had more in common with me than I ever expected. Yet even in victory I carried scars. Late at night, I would remember the whispers of society, the condescension in their voices, the way they dismissed me for my disability and for my blackness. Those wounds could not be erased by money or power, but they could be transformed. That is why I established the Williams Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting Black and disabled entrepreneurs who dream of building something of their own. I wanted others like me to know they were not burdens, not mistakes, not pitiful. They were powerful, and the world needed their brilliance. Each grant awarded, each business funded, felt like rewriting a page of history. And then came the secret I had carried close to my chest. Months into my plan, the experimental treatments Melanie had connected me to began to show results. The feeling returned slowly, first a tingle, then a faint strength. I practiced in silence, every step painful, every movement fragile, but I kept it hidden. My wheelchair became more than necessity, it became my shield. Behind it, Martin never saw the strength returning. He never imagined that the woman he had abandoned as broken had already begun to heal. The day I stood alone in my office, legs trembling but holding me steady, tears streamed down my face. Not because of the pain but because I knew the world had been wrong. I was never powerless. I had only been underestimated. Looking back, I realized Martin's betrayal was the spark that ignited everything. If he had not discarded me, perhaps I would have remained the dutiful wife, content in the shadows of his empire. But by stripping me of dignity, he forced me to find my own. By mocking my blackness, by treating my wheelchair as weakness, he unknowingly handed me the weapon I used to defeat him. He thought I would disappear quietly, but instead I became the architect of his destruction. Today, when I roll through the halls of Thomson Williams Enterprises, the new name I gave to the empire, I see employees who look at me with respect, not pity. I see a company rebuilt on integrity, not greed. And when Martin passes my office door, shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, I see the reminder that even the most powerful can be brought to their knees when they mistake silence for surrender. My story is not just about revenge. It is about resilience, about refusing to accept the roles society assigns us. I was the woman they called pitiful, but I became the woman who made them choke on their words. If you have ever been told you are less because of your race, your body, or your circumstance, remember this. The best revenge is not just survival, it is transformation. It is proving them wrong with every breath you take. So I ask you, if the world tried to erase you, if those closest to you betrayed you, what would you do? Would you fade quietly? Or would you rise and make them watch as you claimed everything they thought you could never hold? If this story moved you, don't just scroll away, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear that strength can rise from pain. And make sure to subscribe for more stories that prove silence is never defeat. Now I want to hear from you. If the world tried to erase you, would you choose quiet survival? Or would you fight back and make them regret ever underestimating you? Tell me in the comments, I'll be reading.